This newspaper is called the New York American. This particular one is the May 25th, 1833 edition. And in my past life as Mathew Franklin Whittier, I wrote for this newspaper as a young man in late teens and early 20s. I found almost 400 of these articles, and they cover book reviews, theater reviews, editorials, essays, and other types of things that one might expect. I've identified this as Mathew Franklin Whittier. There is one doctoral student in 1930 who claimed it for Charles Fenno Hoffman. I've disproved that claim. In 1844 to 1846, this same asterisk or star shows up in the New York Tribune, about 238 articles there. That has been attributed mistakenly by scholars to transcendentalist Margaret Fuller. She was the literary editor, but Mathew Franklin Whittier was the secret author of almost all of those as well. You can compare them and see that it's the same author. I have addressed all of these issues in 3 papers, which I'm going to link below this video. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. This particular edition carries Mathew Franklin Whittier's star-signed review of Frankenstein when it first came out. And that's what I'm going to read for you today. And my feeling about it is that it's very pertinent right now as we're looking at AI coming into being, and we're looking at people giving autonomy to artificial intelligence, which I think is utter folly. I personally, in my observations and my dealings with ChatGPT-4 and Bard, I find that it's a bullshitter. It's an extremely quick, adept bullshitter with a prodigious memory, but that's all it is. It has no intelligence. It has no consciousness. It never will. And it's a monster, basically. It's a Frankenstein. So I thought it was a good time to read this review. I'm going to go ahead and read it in its entirety. It's difficult to read. The type is small. I have to kind of go slow with it, so I apologize for the slow reading. And if I make any errors, I'm not going to go back and try to dub them in as I have sometimes in the past. Just have to understand that it's very difficult for me to read this type. So without further ado, I'm going to read my own past life review of Frankenstein when it was first published. Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, by Mrs. Shelley, 2 volumes, Philadelphia, Carey, Len and Blanchard. This strange and powerfully written story is one of the most original, some may say absurd, conceptions that ever entered the brain of a writer of fiction. The story is briefly this. Frankenstein, a young and ardent Genoese student, after pursuing the branches of chemistry and anatomy with great zeal and success, conceives the extravagant idea of forming, by the aid of these 2 sciences, an animated creature in his own form, a human being like himself. For this end, he passes his days in the laboratory and his nights in charnel houses, resolving the various forms of animal matter into its elements, and watching the gradual transition of decaying mortality as it passes through every loathsome shape into its original dust. At last, after consuming months in examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation as exemplified in the change from life to death and from death to life, his skill in each branch of natural philosophy that relates to physiology enables Frankenstein, with incredible labor and fatigue, to discover the cause of generation and life. But instead of pausing here and resting contented with his stupendous discovery, although his health is already broken by extreme devotion to his terrible studies, he at once sets his mechanical contrivance to work to construct a frame upon which to hang his wonderful discovery, to form a body in which to place the vitality he was able to call into being. The intricacies and complexities of the human system in men of the ordinary mold are too minute for him to attempt at once a creature of the common scale, and he therefore proceeds to form lifeless matter into a gigantic shape and bestow animation upon the monster as it grows to life beneath his hands. The result of his unhallowed labors is a terrific-looking creature whose exaggerated features, though imbued with life, preserve all the disgusting peculiarities of the separate corpses from which they are formed. His watery eyes roll in their dim white sockets, and his black lips quaver in frightful relief to his ghostly complexion, and Frankenstein shrinks from the monster he had so rashly called into being as it stands erect in its unearthly proportions, glowering upon the daring mortal that had caused its existence. He rushes from his apartment as the gigantic creature, whom it would be vain to contend with, attempts to detain him. But after being long withheld by mingled fear and horror from returning to the chamber where he had left his hideous creation, he can find no vestige by which to trace its departure, and he remains filled with ominous thoughts as to his destiny being involved for the future with that of the demoniacal corpse to which he had given life. And now comes the most horrible part of the story. This fearfully uncouth creature, though gifted with several noble instincts, is repulsed in all his efforts to excite the sympathy of the beings in whose shape he had been formed. He is treated like a monster, and after being hunted down like a wild beast, becomes at last a fiend in earnest, and enters upon a career of outrages upon mankind, which, after destroying all the kindred of Frankenstein, results at last in the death of both. Such is the outline of this fearful story, the relation of which, if not occasionally almost impious, certainly trenches at times upon what most men regard as hallowed. But as for the ultimate moral of the tale, we confess ourselves unable to discover that it is of the baneful character represented by some of the British critics. Frankenstein might be well taken to represent those rash individuals who, from having successfully explored a few of the most mysterious paths of knowledge, would carry their presumptuous ken through that veil which is at last interposed between the Creator and the creature, while the hideous result of his daring and ingenious labors in its horrible departure from the physical and moral perfection he aimed at, represents how impossible it is for finite minds, in conceiving a better order of creation than that of which we form a part, to grasp each contingency that must have entered into the mind of an infinite being when he called us into existence. We have, however, given so much room already to Frankenstein that it must now be left for more thoughtful heads to make their own deductions from the story, which, for those who like once in a while to, quote, sup on horrors, is delightfully demoniac.